Something mind-blowing happened in court. On the 9th of January 2017, a district attorney stood in front of the cameras and with one word, he changed court history.
This is one of the most well-thought-out, well-executed plans.
Diabolical.
Absolutely. The woman he was describing was named Michelle Hadley. Just 4 days earlier, she was being held in jail, charged with stalking and attempted rape. With those charges, she could spend the rest of her life behind bars. The evidence against her looked airtight. Threatening emails sent in her name, explicit ads posted online under her identity. Strangers, real physical strangers, arriving at a family's front door expecting her. A restraining order, a reported assault, every piece of it pointed in one direction. But that's not the fun part. Every piece of it was false, assembled by someone else, brick by brick, to bury her. This film is not going to ask whether Michelle Hadley was innocent. A prosecutor said so on camera. A federal jury said so under oath. A federal appeals court said so in writing. That question is closed. The question this film asks is the one those three answers leave open. How do you manufacture a case this convincing out of nothing at all? Who has the skill and the access and the cold patience to do it? And after it nearly works, what in the end gives them away? It began the way a surprising number of these do, with money. Specifically, a condo. In 2013, Michelle Hadley was in her mid-20s. She was a graduate student working toward an MBA at Chapman University in Orange County, the part of Southern California where the freeways are wide, the neighborhoods are quiet, and serious violent crime is mostly something that happens on television. The people who knew her described someone capable and organized, the sort of person who kept her calendar full and her plans on track. An ordinary, ambitious life, moving in an ordinary, ambitious direction. That year, she met a man named Ian Diaz. He was older than her, and he carried a kind of authority most people never encounter up close. Ian Diaz was a deputy United States Marshal. The substance of his job was assessing threats. When someone menaced a federal judge, it was people like Diaz who studied the message, traced its origin, and decided how seriously to take it. He had spent his career learning how a threat is constructed, how an investigation is run, and, this is the part that matters, how the people running it decide what to believe. Hold on to that. Of every fact in this story, it is the one that carries the most weight. The man at the center of this case did not stumble into it. He was a professional in exactly the discipline the case would turn on. For a while, they were a couple. Then, by the summer of 2015, they weren't. The relationship ended. What did not end was the condominium. The year before, the two of them had bought a place together in Anaheim. Michelle had put down somewhere around $14,000. The mortgage behind it ran to nearly $460,000 more. When the relationship dissolved, that debt did not dissolve with it. Her name stayed on the loan. His life stayed in the house. And the ordinary grinding problem of untangling the two of them, who pays, whose name comes off, who walks away clean, became the ground everything else grew out of. Everything you're about to see is built from primary documents, a federal indictment, the record of a criminal trial, a sworn deposition in which one single word, spoken under oath, took 7 years to matter. But the documents come later. First came the messages. And the first thing to understand about them is why everyone who read them was so completely certain they had come from Michelle Hadley. When Michelle moved out, Ian stayed. That was the arrangement, at least in practice. He lived in the condo, and she carried a name on a loan for a home she no longer set foot in. She wanted out of it, off the mortgage, free of the liability, done. By every account that survives in the record, he did not make that simple. For months, the two of them fought about it the way estranged people fight about money. In emails, in accusations, in the slow accumulation of resentment that has nowhere else to go. There is nothing unusual in that. On any given day, in every county in the country, people who used to love each other are arguing over a deed and a balance, and the question of whose signature comes off first. It is one of the most common disputes in American life. It almost never becomes a criminal conspiracy. Prosecutors would later tell a jury that this was the engine of the whole thing. Their theory was simple. Ian Diaz wanted Michelle Hadley gone, not just off the paperwork, but gone in a way that solved the problem for good. And the way to make a person disappear, if you understand how the system works, is not to make them vanish. It is to make everyone else believe they are dangerous. That was the government's account of the motive, and it is fair to label it as exactly that. The prosecution's theory of why. Motive is the one thing a courtroom argues rather than proves. What the courtroom did prove, past argument, is what happened next. And what happened next did not look like a fight over a condo. It looked like a haunting. In the early weeks of 2016, Ian Diaz met a woman named Angela Connell. They met the way many people meet now, online, through a dating site. And they moved quickly. Within a matter of weeks, they were married. By that spring, Angela Diaz was living in the Anaheim house. On the surface, it read as a fresh start, a marshal and his new wife, beginning again. Underneath, according to the evidence a federal jury would later weigh, something else was beginning. Because the campaign against Michelle Hadley was about to start in earnest, and when investigators finally reconstructed how it had been run, Angela's name would sit at the center of it, right beside her husband's. For now, just hold the name, Angela Connell. She is not a footnote in this story. She is one of its two authors. In May of 2016, the emails started arriving. They came to the Diaz home, and they were not vague. They were detailed, specific, frightening, threats aimed at Angela's safety, written in the voice of someone unstable and escalating. And they appeared, in every visible respect, to come from Michelle Hadley. Several traced back to an online identity that had chosen a single fused word for a name, Lilith is Truth. Here's where you have to hold two facts at the same time, because the police could not, and it cost a woman 3 months of her life. The threats were real. That is the part that made the frame work. These were not imaginary messages, not a story someone told detectives. They existed. They were really sent from real accounts to a real inbox, and a real person really opened them and was really afraid. Any investigator who pulled the file would find genuine, documented, frightening harassment. That was true. And the name on the sender was a lie. That was the only false thing in the pile. But it was the thing everything else hung from. The messages were authentic. The authorship was fiction. And because the messages were so obviously real, no one thought hard enough about whether the author was. That is the whole architecture of what was done to Michelle Hadley, visible in miniature in the very first emails. Build something genuinely true. Attach the wrong name to it. Then let everyone's instincts do the rest. Angela took the messages to a courthouse. She came out with a restraining order against Michelle Hadley. A judge had looked at what he was shown, the emails, the fear, the apparent pattern, and signed his name to it. And with that signature, the trap gained something powerful, official documentation. The record now said in the language of the court that Michelle was a threat, not an accusation anymore, a finding on paper with a judge's authority behind it. Every future step now had a foundation. When the ads came, when the strangers arrived, when the police were called, investigators would not be starting from zero. They would be starting from a court order that already named Michelle Hadley as the danger. Each new piece of manufactured evidence didn't have to convince anyone on its own. It only had to fit a story a judge had already stamped. And the messages kept coming. Longer, uglier, more specific with each one. Every single one made Michelle look guiltier. And that is the tell, the thing that should have caught someone's eye and didn't. Real harassment is chaotic. It lashes out. It contradicts itself. It has bad days. This was too clean. Every message pushed in exactly the same direction, like water that only ever runs downhill because someone dug the channel. A file does not build itself this neatly by accident. This one was not an accident. And then it stopped being words on a screen and started arriving in person. Ads began appearing on Craigslist, posted under Michelle Hadley's name. They invited strangers to the Diaz home for a violent sexual encounter staged as a fantasy. The ads carried explicit instructions that any resistance, any protest, any pleading was part of the scene and should be ignored. Men answered. Men drove to the house. Men knocked. This film is not going to reproduce that language, and it does not need to. What matters is the mechanism, because the mechanism is the coldest thing in the entire case. The ads did not simply accuse Michelle of harassment. Paper accusations are easy to doubt. What these ads did was manufacture a live, physical walking stream of corroboration. Real men answering a real ad, driving to a real address, knocking on a real door, each one an unwitting piece of evidence that a woman was dangerously, criminally out of control. To a neighbor, to a responding officer, to anyone watching the house, the proof was undeniable because it was standing on the porch. And the men themselves had no idea what they were. They believed they were answering an invitation. They were props, cast without their knowledge or consent in a production designed to end with someone else in prison. There is testimony in the record that this was not the first time such a scenario had surfaced in Diaz's life. Witnesses would later describe him proposing this same kind of Craigslist arrangement before. But hold that. It belongs to the trial. For now, keep the image. Strangers at a door, sent by an ad, arriving as evidence. And as far as every institution watching was concerned, the woman who sent them was the one already under a restraining order. On the 13th of June, 2016, the police came to the Diaz home. And here the case picks up its second problem, the one that turns it from a story about two cruel people into a story about an institution. Because the man reporting all this terror was not an ordinary frightened husband. Ian Diaz was a deputy United States Marshal, and according to the account laid out in his federal indictment, he did not leave that fact at the door. He pressed the responding officers to arrest his ex-fiancée. He did it in blunt, profane, unmistakable terms, that she needed to be in handcuffs, that she belonged in a padded room, demanding to know at what point exactly this woman was finally going to be taken in. Picture the position that puts a local patrol officer in. You are not hearing this from a civilian. You are hearing it from a federal law enforcement officer, a member of the same profession, someone the system is built to trust. And he is not asking you to investigate. He is telling you what the conclusion is. That is the thumb on the scale. Not a conspiracy of crooked cops, something quieter and more ordinary than that. A badge in a doorway, lending its authority to a lie, and a local department with no particular reason to doubt one of its own. Keep that pressure in mind. It is the closest this case comes to a second villain. And later, when a lawsuit forces the question, we will come back to the one thing about it that can actually be said out loud. 11 days later, on the 24th of June, the trap closed. Angela reported that she had been attacked inside the home, physically assaulted, she said, by one of the men that Michelle had sent. That was the keystone, the moment the scattered pieces snapped into a single, obvious picture in the eyes of the Anaheim Police Department. The strangers at the door were no longer a mystery to explain. They were foot soldiers dispatched by an obsessed woman. And now, one of them had turned violent. The threat on paper had become a threat in flesh. Look at the file the way a detective would have. A court-ordered restraining order, months of escalating documented threats, explicit ads posted in the suspect's name, frightened calls to police. And now, a physical assault with the victim ready to name exactly who had sent her attacker. By any normal standard, it was a complete case. So the detectives stopped asking whether. The only question left was how quickly. Sit inside that certainty for a moment, because on paper, what they were holding looked airtight. Michelle Hadley was arrested. Then, after a release, she was arrested a second time. The record is specific about that: taken into custody, let go, and taken again as the case against her hardened. The charges were not minor, and their weight is the point. Felony stalking, attempted forcible rape. These are among the most serious charges the state can bring against a person who has not killed anyone, and stacked together the way they were, they carried an exposure that reached toward the rest of her life. This was not a woman facing a fine and a few months. This was a woman facing the real possibility that she would grow old inside a prison for crimes that existed only because someone had invented them. There is a detail in the federal record that lands harder the longer you sit with it. In the federal documents that would eventually tell the true version of this story, Michelle Hadley does not appear under her own name. She appears as Jane Doe, the placeholder the justice system reserves for the victims it is trying to protect. That is what she was from the very first day, the victim. But in the summer of 2016, the system had her role exactly reversed. The person it would one day shield as Jane Doe, it was, at that moment, preparing to prosecute for rape. She spent 88 days in the Orange County Jail. This film is going to state that plainly and then resist the pull to dramatize it, because the restraint is the respect. 88 days. Not as a plot point, as time, real time, subtracted from a real life. A graduate student who had done nothing, sitting in a cell, while somewhere beyond the walls, a machinery she couldn't see kept grinding forward on the assumption of her guilt. And outside those walls, the story was doing what stories do. The narrative of the obsessed stalker, the woman who had terrorized a marshal's new wife, who had sent strangers to assault her, moved through the community and eventually into the press. It was a good story. It was vivid and frightening and completely wrong, and none of that slowed it down. Then it reached her. When Michelle's name appeared in the newspapers, the coverage did not stay outside. It came into the jail. She received a threat while she was incarcerated from someone who had read about the crime she had supposedly committed and decided she had earned it. Sit with the full shape of that. She had been framed for a campaign of threats. She was now being threatened in a cell because of the frame. The lie had become real enough to generate its own victims, and the first new one it found was the original victim, locked up and unable to say otherwise. There is a temptation, watching this from the outside, to ask how nobody noticed, how a whole apparatus of trained professionals could look at a manufactured file and see only guilt. The honest answer is uncomfortable, because the file was good and because nothing in it invited a second look. But a case is not only what it contains, it is also what it doesn't quite explain, the loose thread, the detail at the edge that sits slightly wrong. This file had a few of those. They were small. They were easy to step over. And for 88 days, everyone did. Until someone didn't. So why did it hold? Why did trained, competent investigators look at all of this and see, without much hesitation, a guilty woman? Because the forgery was genuinely good. This was not a crude frame-up. The accounts had been falsely registered to look like hers. The messages were written to sound like her. Her cadence, her grievances, the plausible voice of a real ex-girlfriend who had really been fighting over a real condo. Every digital breadcrumb in the case pointed the same direction, and the police followed the breadcrumbs, because following breadcrumbs is not a mistake. It is the method. It is what evidence is supposed to do. The problem is that a trail of breadcrumbs assumes something no one questioned. It assumes the crumbs fell where they landed. It assumes no one laid them there on purpose, walking backward, dropping each one exactly where a follower would expect to find it. And at some point, not nearly soon enough, but at some point, one question finally changed. For months, everyone looking at this case had been asking the thing the evidence was designed to make them ask. What do these messages say? What do they prove about Michelle Hadley? Someone finally asked a different question instead. Not what? Where? Where did these actually come from? Not whose name is on them, but what machine, in what place, actually sent them? That question is the hinge the whole case turns on. And the answer began to take Michelle Hadley's life apart from the lie, one thread at a time. Here is what the public record establishes about how the frame came apart. And here, too, is where this film is going to be more careful than most, and tell you plainly where the confirmed facts stop. The people who built this campaign had worked to stay invisible, and they were not amateurs about it. They registered accounts under false identities. They routed their activity through VPNs, the tools built specifically to erase a location, to take the simple question of where did this come from and bury it under layers of misdirection. They communicated in encrypted messages. And when it mattered, they deleted accounts behind them, trying to pull the ladder up so that no one could follow. This was concealment designed by someone who understood how the followers think, which is exactly what you would expect, given who one of them was. But the scheme had a seam, and the seam was not in the hiding, it was in the handling. These threats did not simply sit in some anonymous corner of the internet. They were delivered. They were forwarded to the Anaheim police, carried into the investigation, and placed in front of detectives. And according to the government's case, some of them were altered along the way, edited before they were handed over by the very people insisting they were the ones being terrorized. The campaign could not stay hidden and be useful at the same time. To work, it had to surface. And every time it surfaced, it left a fingerprint. When investigators, and critically Michelle's own defense, stopped accepting the messages at face value and started pulling on where and how they had actually moved, the whole structure began to run backward. The arrows that had pointed so cleanly at Michelle Hadley wavered and turned and started pointing back toward the house they had come from. And here this film stops on purpose. You may have heard a cleaner, more satisfying version of this moment, that it all came down to a single IP address, traced in one triumphant instant to their living room. The real record is more careful than that, and so are we. The precise forensic method, exactly how the analysts pulled the truth out of the wreckage, lives in the trial exhibits, and until those documents are in hand, this film will not dress up a guess as a fact. The honest version is smaller and stronger for being true. They built something to disappear behind. It didn't hold, and what it had been hiding was the exact opposite of what everyone believed. By the end of 2016, the Orange County District Attorney's Office had arrived at a conclusion no prosecutor ever wants to reach, let alone announce. They had charged the wrong person. And it was worse than a wrong suspect, worse than an honest miss on a hard case.
It's often said that true life is stranger than fiction. The facts of this case make that statement spot on.
They had taken the actual victim of an elaborate, months-long criminal scheme and had spent the length of that scheme prosecuting her for it. The woman they had been building a rape case against was the person the whole thing had been done to. Everything they thought they were looking at was upside down and had been from the first day. There is no clean way to walk that back. But to the office's credit, they did not bury it. They stood up in public and said it. On the 9th of January 2017, the district attorney faced the cameras. The charges against Michelle Hadley were dismissed, all of them, and the prosecutor described her, without hedging, as an innocent victim of a diabolical scheme. That is the sentence this film opened on. Now you know what you were looking at when you heard it. Not the end of a case against her, but the public admission that the case had never been real. And the same office, the same day, turned the machinery around. It charged Angela Diaz. Michelle Hadley walked out of it. After 88 days, after a frame that reached toward a life sentence after being threatened in a cell for a crime committed against her. She was free, and she was, at last, believed. But notice who did not walk out of anything. Notice who, on that January afternoon, was still carrying a federal badge and going home at night. The man who had stood in his own doorway demanding her arrest. The professional, the one who understood exactly how all of this worked, had not been charged with a thing. Angela had been named, but the question of whether Ian Diaz would ever answer for any of it was at that moment completely open. And it would stay open for years. Here is the part the frame's collapse did not fix: time. Michelle Hadley was cleared in January of 2017. Ian Diaz was not indicted until May of 2021. For more than 4 years, while the woman he framed rebuilt a life out of the wreckage, the man who had built the scheme remained free, and for a stretch of that time still employed as a federal officer. Justice in this case was not swift. It was correct eventually, and it was thorough, but it arrived on a delay measured in years, and the years were their own kind of cost. Angela Diaz pleaded guilty. In the state case brought by Orange County, she admitted her role, and she was sentenced to 5 years. It matters to be exact here, because 2 different courts handled Angela differently, and collapsing them together gets the facts wrong. In the state prosecution, she was convicted on her own guilty plea, in her own voice, in open court. That is settled. Later, when the federal government built its own larger case, Angela occupied a different position entirely. She was named as an unindicted co-conspirator, identified on the federal record as part of the scheme, but never federally charged and never federally tried. 2 courts, 2 very different outcomes, both of them true at once. In one, she is a convicted felon who admitted what she did. In the other, she is a named participant who was never made to stand trial. Hold both because both are the record. What the record also makes clear is that Angela was never the one the government most wanted. Her guilty plea closed her chapter. The larger question, the one left open on the courthouse steps in 2017, was about the other author, the one with the badge. Before the federal case, though, came the lawsuit. And the lawsuit is where this story briefly touches its second villain, carefully, because the record here is made of allegations, not findings. In 2018, Michelle Hadley sued the city of Anaheim. Her complaint told the institutional half of the story, the half about how a manufactured file had been allowed to become a criminal prosecution. It alleged that the police had built their case against her on emails her own lawyers described as clearly doctored. It alleged that officers had set aside the caution the situation called for and moved to charge her anyway, carried along by a fellow officer's certainty. Every word of that is an allegation. It was pleaded in a lawsuit. It was never tested to a verdict. No court ever ruled that the department failed. That distinction is not a technicality, and this film is going to honor it. What can be said as fact is only this. In 2021, the city of Anaheim settled with Michelle Hadley. The amount was not disclosed. The settlement carried no admission of wrongdoing. That is the edge of what the record permits. For now. There is a fuller, harder story sitting behind that settlement about how exactly a police file gets talked into believing the wrong thing and who signed off along the way. But that story lives in documents this film does not yet have in hand. It is a story for another day, and we are not going to pretend to tell it before the paperwork lets us. Here we mark the seam and move on to the reckoning that did get proven in the highest stakes venue of all. Which brings us finally back to the promise made at the very start of this film.
Here are the
a
best
single
transition
word
sound effects
spoken
for you,
under
and
oath
their download
that took
links is
7
in
years to
description.
matter. It was spoken during Michelle's own civil lawsuit, As part of that case, Ian Diaz was required to sit for a sworn deposition to answer questions under oath with a court reporter recording every word. And at one point, he was asked a direct question, whether he had ever accessed the accounts at the center of the case. He gave a one-word answer: no. It was a lie. And a lie told under oath is not just a moral failure or a bad moment on the record. It is a specific federal crime with a specific name: perjury. That single syllable, no, became a criminal charge in its own right, one of the counts Ian Diaz would eventually stand trial on. The man whose entire profession was built on sworn testimony and the integrity of the record had lied to the record, and the record kept it. And years later, when Diaz tried to overturn his conviction, the appeals court went back to that exact exchange. They examined that one word in its full context, and they let it stand. The lie he told to protect himself in a civil case became one of the bricks in the federal case that put him away. He built the entire scheme to make a woman look like a liar. In the end, it was his own lie, under oath, that helped finish him. And the perjury did not stand alone. Beside it sat a charge of obstruction for the wider effort to derail a federal proceeding. Look at the 4 counts together, and a pattern surfaces. 2 were the frame itself, the conspiracy, and the cyberstalking, and 2 were what he did to protect it, the lie under oath and the obstruction. He was convicted not only of building the machine, but of everything he did to keep it from coming apart. In May of 2021, nearly 5 years after Michelle Hadley was first arrested, a federal grand jury indicted Ian Diaz. He was taken into custody, and the case moved into federal court, where it would carry his name: United States versus Diaz. The case the government brought was not thin, and it did not rest on inference. Because Diaz was a federal officer, the prosecution was handled by the Justice Department's Public Integrity Section, working alongside its computer crime specialists, the unit the department reserves for cases where the accused carried a badge. The investigation behind it had been run by the Inspector General's office, which had opened the file back in 2017, and spent years reconstructing what had actually been done, and by whom. And when they laid it out at trial, they did not describe a vague scheme. They described specific acts. The government's case set out how Diaz had personally steered the men who answered the Craigslist ads toward the home. How he had forwarded the fake threats to the Anaheim police, at times posing as his own wife, sending from her email account. How some of those threats had been altered before they reached investigators. How he had insisted over and over that his ex-fiancée was a genuine danger. And how he had used his position as a deputy U.S. Marshal to press local officers to arrest her, charge her, and jail her. 5 documented forms of participation from a man who had spent his career on the other side of exactly this kind of file. The jury heard something else too. Witnesses from Diaz's own past testified to a pattern that the idea at the center of the frame, the staged Craigslist encounter, was not something he dreamed up for Michelle Hadley. It was something he had reached for before. In March of 2023, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty on all 4 counts. Conspiracy to commit cyberstalking, perjury, obstruction, each one proven to 12 ordinary people beyond a reasonable doubt. Consider the full shape of what that verdict said. The man whose professional expertise was distinguishing real threats from fabricated ones had spent months fabricating them. The man trained to see through deception had built a deception elaborate enough to jail an innocent woman for 88 days, and nearly for life. And a jury of people with none of his training, none of his access, none of his skill, sat in a room, looked at the evidence, and saw straight through the entire construction. Everything he knew about how investigations get believed had not been enough. In the end, the machinery he understood so well was the machinery that convicted him. He was sentenced to 121 months in federal prison, just past 10 years. He was taken into custody from the courtroom. No delay, no surrender date, remanded on the spot. He appealed. In January of 2025, the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit affirmed his conviction, and with that, the last door closed. There was nowhere left for the argument to go. The man who had built a machine to make a woman disappear, who had used a federal badge and a false identity, and a VPN, and a stranger's willingness to answer an ad, is now himself a number in the federal system. His earliest release sits somewhere in the 2030s. The woman he tried to erase was believed, was cleared, and walked free years before he will. That is the full arc of the question this film opened with. How does an innocent woman face life for a crime that never happened? And who built it? She faced it because the frame was nearly perfect. And the man who built it is finishing the decade in a cell. There is one more fact. It is small, and it is true, and it is the one to end on. The day the federal jury returned its verdict against Ian Diaz, the day the case that began with a frightened woman in a jail cell finally, completely turned around, Michelle Hadley was not in the courtroom to hear it. She was in a hospital. She was giving birth to her first child, a daughter. On the same day, a jury told the world what had been done to her and named the man who did it. She was becoming a mother. She would later say her life had been full of strange coincidences, like that one, the timing of things arriving all at once. She called her daughter a rainbow after a very long storm. 88 days in a cell for a crime that never happened. Nearly a life sentence built out of nothing. 7 years for the man who built it to be convicted of building it. And a verdict that arrived on the same day as a child. That is where the record ends. So do we.